Julia.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's going great. We have a very special guest with us today.
Yes, we do.
Playwright, director, lyricist, actor, Ashley Griffin.
Hey, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on and chatting with us and talking to us about this amazing play that you wrote.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So why don't we go ahead and get started with some trivia here? Our typical trivia that we have that Julia and I like to make a little bit themed for the play that we're reading. So Julia, why don't you start us off?
Okay. As Katie said, I like to tie in the title of the show to my question. So, what is Julia's favorite thing to do in the snow? A, go sledding. B, go skiing. And C, go snowboarding.
I'm going to get this so wrong. I can just feel it in my bones. But I'm going to go with the least obvious choice and say snowboarding. Ashley, what are your thoughts?
I have no basis with which to make a decision. But I'm going to go with sledding because there's something just so joyous and childlike fun about it, and you don't need like a bunch of preparation or equipment to do it.
That's a good choice. What's the answer?
You are both incorrect.
Yay!
Oh my gosh. Of course we are.
I'm actually quite terrified of snowboarders because when I was 3 years old, I was skiing and a snowboarder ran over me.
Oh my gosh.
And then he tried to make it my fault. He was like, oh, she got in my way. And my parents were like, she's 3.
She was in the way. Oh my God, that's so funny. Wow.
All right. So, Ashley, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Does mine need to be snow themed as well?
No.
Okay. So it will still be story themed, I guess, a little bit. Okay. I was featured when I was 8 years old in the Star Trek fan club magazine. This one. I was born and raised in LA, and my summer job for a little while was being a Disney princess at Disneyland. And my family is really good at ancestry and lineage and whatnot. And part of my family is descended from the original royal family of Wales before it was taken over by England.
Ooh. So this is 2 truths and a lie.
Yeah.
Ooh.
That is very hard.
I'm going to guess that the first one is a lie. What do you think, Katie?
I think I'm going to go with number 2 as the lie.
I want both of your rationales.
My rationale is that I don't have much. My rationale is that I'm assuming that maybe you were in New York more than in LA, and so the Disney princess thing, I don't know. That's the best I got.
My rationale is that I've heard your Disney princess reel, so the Disney princess thing makes a lot of sense.
Well, I'll see myself out. Thank you.
No, Katie, you're actually correct.
Ooh.
I always wanted to be a Disney princess at Disneyland, but they won't let you audition until you're 18, and by that point I was in college, so I couldn't audition.
Wow.
Oh.
Wow. Well,
but I do the voice of every Disney princess highly accurately, if anybody would like to listen to my reel.
Oh my gosh.
So good.
Thank you.
Wow,
My favorite is the Snow White voice, which ties in perfectly with what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll finish up this trivia section. So mine is story themed. So mine is, which of these classic story characters have I not played? A, Hansel in Hansel and Gretel. B, Wendy in Peter Pan. And C, Flat Stanley in Flat Stanley.
I know you've played Flat Stanley.
Yeah, I was going to say that one's too out there for it to not be true. I
want to see you as Hansel really bad.
Okay, so we've got a Hansel. What about you, Ashley? What are your thoughts?
Which one I think is real or which one I think is the lie?
Which one is not a character I've played?
Okay, so I'm going to go with Wendy, and here's my rationale. A, the flat Stanley, Julia already ruined it, and I was like, that if that was a lie, it's like too obvious. I feel like Hansel is in a similar category in that I could just see the trauma of like getting cast as Hansel in a situation where you're like, really, that's who I'm playing? And Wendy's like, we would all love to play her, so I feel like you should play her, but maybe because life isn't fair, you didn't get the opportunity.
I appreciate the thought of rationale that went in here for both of you. And I regret to inform you, you're both incorrect. I did not.
I'm glad you got to play Wendy, though.
I did not. Yeah, I did. I actually did not play Flat Stanley in Flat Stanley, but I was in Flat Stanley. I played Flat Stanley's father in Flat Stanley.
That makes it even better.
And I played Hansel in Hansel and Gretel in a one-act play festival for a school that I didn't go to.
Yes, you did.
So that was
amazing.
That was a super weird experience, but yeah, Flat Stanley is the one that I did not do. So
please tell me you wore lederhosen when you played Hansel.
Yes.
I can tell you I wore a really good looking short blonde wig. That I can tell you.
Please tell me they just like got you a lot of candy that you just had to eat the entire show.
I was cast like a week before it went up because it wasn't, again, I didn't go there. So I did theater in the area and they just needed an extra body and were like, come on. So I got like all dressed up in a suit. It was like,
by the way, I love how like we need an extra body is we need you to play one of the title characters in this play.
Yeah, it was a super duper weird experience, but Julia mentioned in our last podcast that I guess I have a lot of weird theater experiences, and I guess that's true, Julia.
I feel like we all do. You have to.
Just like the weirdest thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes for good podcast material.
Yeah, it does.
Katie, I have a brand new obsession.
Does it involve music and candles?
You know it.
Then it's got to be Sense Memory. Their soy vegan candles are natural, good for the planet, and 100% homemade. These candles make the perfect gift for friends and family because not only do they have these fun themes, but each candle also comes with a corresponding personally curated Spotify playlist to set the mood.
My best friend is the biggest T-Swift fan in the world, and she absolutely loved the Folklore Evermore and Cottagecore candle I gave her this Christmas. I tried out the Cocoa Butter Bitch candle, and let me tell you, Katie, I felt like a classy lady.
If that isn't enough to win you over, shipping is covered in the price of the candle. Yeah, I'll say that again. Shipping is covered in the price of the candle so that you can say goodbye to all these hidden fees and say hello to supporting small business owners.
Not to mention that every time you purchase a candle with Sense Memory, you are directly supporting an arts organization. To find your perfect candle, visit CaitlinCrawl.com/sensememory or follow them at sense.memory on Instagram. That's at SCENTS.memory on Instagram. So, do we want to just hop right in?
Yeah, let's do it. Do you want to give us a little background about the play?
Absolutely. I'll give a little. So, Ashley, what we normally do is I give a little summary, and Katie tells us about the author.
I'm really excited to hear you summarize this play, Julia.
I actually borrowed the summary from your website because I knew I could find a really good summary there.
Perfect.
So, I'm going to use my dramatic voice.
Okay.
Utilizing a structure akin to Cloud Atlas and the Hours, Snow follows 3 disparate storylines that all revolve around the fairy tale Snow White. Exploring the power and importance of storytelling, in Snow, 6 actors playing multiple roles tell the stories of the Grimm brothers, who originally collected and published the classic fairy tales, The Campbells, a Victorian theatrical family whose lives begin to mirror Snow White, and modern-day Astrid, a young woman who, after her abusive mother puts her in a coma, must decide whether or not to wake up. Incorporating aspects of American Gods and classic storytelling techniques a la Peter and the Starcatcher, Snow is a dark and moving play that mines our storytelling traditions in both style and subject matter.
Perfect. Yeah, as Julia said, I usually talk about the author here, but we've got an interesting situation in which the author's right here.
Right here. Talk away.
So why don't you go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I have been a performer. I started acting when I was 2. I was telling you before we started recording, I wrote my first show when I was 8 for my 3rd grade class, and thought that I would never be able to be a professional writer because I started too late in life, because I had 5 years acting experience before I started writing. But I continued doing both. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be the first female Anthony Newley. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He's awesome. And I went to Performing Arts High School. I have a BFA from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, and then stayed in New York. And since then, as a performer, I've performed on and off Broadway and film and TV. And then as a writer, I've had my work produced and or developed at New World Stages, MTC, Playwrights Horizons, La Mama, ATA, ART, and very cool stuff. My off-Broadway play Trial that was directed by Lori Petty. I won the Well Life Network Award for it and a county commendation. And I am in development with a few pieces. I've actually been a ghostwriter for Broadway as well. So yeah, I guess that's like the very fast summary of me. I've gotten to be known a bit for, I guess my niche is magical realism and knowing an enormous amount about fairy tales. Heightened language, magical realism, and some incorporation of fairy tales. Not that all my plays deal with that in those ways, but those have kind of tended to be hallmarks a little bit. And this play, Snow, has had a couple New York productions, including off-Broadway, where it was nominated for, I think, 3 New York Innovative Theater Awards for the second production of it. And it had development at Playwrights Horizons. And yeah, what else would you like to know?
I actually wrote down a couple of questions that I had. And the first one really is, what inspired you to write this?
It's a whole story. And I'm sorry it's a little long-winded, but I don't know. I feel like maybe it might be helpful to any aspiring artists out there, because it came out of the worst experience I ever had as a writer. So I got a commission to write a children's play version of Snow White. So that's where it all started. I actually have always thought it would be really cool to do a site-specific production in Central Park, where you start at Belvedere Castle and like go to the Swiss Cottage, and like I've always thought that would be really cool. So I was supposed to write the children's theater production of it, and I tend to deal with dark themes and whatnot in my work. I've definitely written children's material as well, but Snow White's a fairy tale that has always fascinated me. It's not my favorite fairy tale, but it's fascinated me for a lot of reasons. One is that it breaks a lot of rules of traditional fairy tales. For example, it's the only fairy tale in which being kind to an old woman will not get you a reward. In any other fairy tale, if Snow White had not let the old woman in, she would have suffered some horrible consequence. But in this case, being nice to her, puts her in the sleeping death. Snow White is, I'm sorry, the dumbest heroine in any fairy tale ever. She is. And I mean, in the original story, she's 7, but still, I mean, I've always kind of preferred Sleeping Beauty as a sleeping fairy tale, because, poor Sleeping Beauty has this like one encounter and is, innocently, has this terrible thing happen. Snow White knows like her stepmother wants to kill her and still lets a strange woman in the house like 3 times, just things like that. And also the relationship between the Evil Queen and Snow White always really fascinated me, because if you really go back and read the original story, there's a couple things in there that people they're easy to miss. One is that it says that Snow White's birth mother died like immediately after giving birth, and that less than a year later, the king gets remarried, which means that the queen is the only mother Snow has ever known. It then says that when Snow's 7 is when the mirror starts saying she's the fairest of all. So I always wondered, like, well, what were those 7 years like when the queen had no reason to hate this girl? Also, I know way too much about fairy tales and that the history of how they were transcribed and all that. And I know a lot about the Grimm brothers. And the truly original fairy tale of Snow White was so dark, even the Grimm brothers wouldn't publish it. And in that original version, it's not her stepmother, it's her biological mother. It's not, there's no prince. It's the king who's lusting after his daughter and then goes in the woods, finds her, brings her back, kills her mother, and marries 7-year-old Snow White. And so there was just a lot of things that I was always kind of intrigued by, but never found any version of the fairy tale that I felt like dealt with some of these interesting issues and questions. So I was going to write this children's version, and I ended up kind of, I don't know, sort of thinking, well, why don't I tell the version of Snow White that I would really enjoy? And what I ended up writing was something that it wasn't quite a children's piece, but it wasn't an adult piece either. And we did some readings, and I was sort of feeling like I didn't quite know what this was. And I really liked a lot of things about it, but I was feeling a little unsure. So we end up doing a staged reading of it with a director that I had not worked with before. And I find it very difficult to talk about this experience because it was so terrible. And yet I don't want to give specifics because I don't want to like throw anything under the bus.
Of course.
But I went into this reading being really clear with the people involved. Like, look, these are the questions I have about this piece. This is what I want to, deal with this reading. And the rehearsal time is really important to me because I want to use it to answer some of these questions. Long story short, the rehearsal process ended up never happening. We did this reading with basically no preparation. The things that I knew were issues with the piece were still issues. And then during the talkback, I got like thrown under the bus. And I'm really good at taking feedback. I'm really good at the development process. And I don't know what it was about this reading, but for the first time in my life, I suddenly felt like, am I crazy? Do I not know what I'm doing? Like maybe I should never write another word again as long as I live, which sounds really extreme. And I'd never felt that way. I guess, welcome to being a writer. Like you have to have your initiation at some point, but it was really depressing. There was something, I just fell into this real like bad depression, artistic depression about it. And I didn't know what to do. What happened was I was talking to a friend who happened to be at the reading, and through explaining to them what I wanted to do, I ended up talking about like, well, I did this because, the history of the fairy tales and the Grimm brothers, and it's this and that and whatnot. And she very kindly said, well, not everybody like knows all the stuff about this material that so we don't necessarily get that. And I was like, that's a very salient point. So I basically went home and thought about what is the play that you actually want to write? Like what is it that you really want to be talking about? And I realized that what I really wanted to be talking about was the importance and power of storytelling. Because our culture today, I feel like, is not really a storytelling culture. We don't really have communal stories in the way that we did once upon a time. And I think that it's detrimental and problematic. And I wanted to explore that. So I went back and I fixed the children's play. I finished that commission. I turned into my children's version. But then I was like, okay, let's write this thing. And I basically realized that I was trying to use Snow White to explore this idea of storytelling. And I was trying to sort of cram a bunch of ideas and concepts into this one linear plot line. And a lot of those concepts were deliberately contradictory because it was meant to be looking at sort of more than one side of the issue. So I thought that it might help to sort of open it up and have multiple storylines that all sort of revolved around each other. And so what I then took were the 3 moments in history where our relationship to fairy tales most dramatically changed. And for those of you who don't know, fairy tales, with the exception of those written by Hans Christian Andersen, who actually did write them from scratch, fairy tales were not written by someone. The Grimm brothers did not create Snow White. most fairy tales that we have were transcribed from folk tales that were orally told and passed down from generation to generation. Most of them originated out of the religion of the culture. So, in Germany, for example, fairies, dwarves, and elves were originally, they were worshipped. They were the gods of their culture. And eventually they kind of ended up, the only remnants of them were left in these sort of stories. So they were told orally. They were collected by the Grimm brothers trying to preserve their culture because they were constantly being taken over and destroyed by being in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. And so just by that nature, the Grimm brothers were the first people to set a lot of these fairy tales down. The other one that was doing it was Charles Perrault, but that's a whole other thing that was going on in France. The Grimm brothers were trying to set them down as accurately as possible, but while being accurate, we're also having to condense stories and combine certain stories and edit them. So they sort of, put their own stamp on it. They then continued editing them throughout their lives, making deliberate changes to them. But it was the first time that they were set down and recorded. The next big change happened in Victorian times when fairy tales kind of fell out of fashion with adults and were relegated to the nursery. And because of that, there were new editions that were deliberately written with little morals on the end of them. So when we talk about the idea of fairy tales teaching morals to children, that's something that came along a little bit more in the Victorian era. It wasn't something that was necessarily inherent in them, in all of them in their origins. And then the third one is modern day with Disney. And Disney, very deliberately reinterpreted these stories. And that's kind of what most people know. When they think of Snow White, they think of the Disney Snow White. And I love Disney and I love those versions. But we don't really think of them as being one interpretation. We think of them as being the version of them. So I then had those three timelines. So I had the Grimm brothers, I had the Victorian era, and I had modern day. And so I use those as sort of my tent poles to tell these interweaving stories about, our story. What's the purpose of stories? What's their importance? Why is it important to tell stories about the darker things in our lives? And that's sort of a very long-winded way of how it came about. And so I basically rewrote it and then put it in a drawer because I kind of knew I just needed to get back on the horse, write it, and sort of get over that kind of traumatic thing that happened. And then I randomly happened to mention it to somebody at some point, and they were intrigued and they wanted to read it. And they read it and they thought that it was really good and wanted to do a reading. So we did a reading and everybody was like, wow, there's kind of something here. And that, long story short, ended up leading to our first workshop in New York City and going from there. But that's a very long-winded story about how this play came about.
I love it. I love it.
That's amazing. An amazing story to have too for the origin of this play, and that there's so much detail that went into the thoughts of writing this play. And there's a line in there that you have about comparing it to music composition and how every note in music that a composer writes is so strategically placed and it's purposeful. And obviously the same thing goes for books, for plays, all of that good stuff. And I think that's very, very apparent.
Wait, where did I say that? That's a lovely.
Yeah, I wrote down a lot of quotes. I don't remember exactly where that was, but it was something about talk.
If you find it, let me know, because that's I enjoy that, and I do not remember saying that.
Yeah, it was something about how obviously the words we choose have power in the same. I think it was maybe Shakespeare during the Shakespeare scenes when they're rehearsing Cymbeline. That there's a thing in there.
Yes, in Clara's monologue when she talks about composers take time and pitch and make order out of sound. Storytellers take words and make order out of the chaos of life. That's what it is.
Yep.
Yeah. I wrote down that quote too. I love that quote.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I am curious because obviously there have been stage productions of this, but you also just recently did a Zoom production.
Yeah.
And, it's not one of those scripts where the first time you read it, you're like, oh, I can see people doing this on Zoom.
Nope.
So can you talk a little bit about that process and how this show was adapted for a quarantine audience?
It was really challenging. And I think a lot of my pieces although as I said before, I'm a heightened language person. I'm also a very physical writer. I'm a dancer as well, and physicality in plays is important to me. So this play is no exception. It's a very physical piece. And it's challenging. I mean, I didn't really change the script. It was just sort of more so we used some title cards, and we're very specific about the backgrounds used, and just sort of took a stab at it and tried to let the words carry the bulk of what they were doing. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of just what we did. And who knows? I'm very glad that we have the medium of Zoom to do things on. But yeah, I think we probably just let the words take a little more front and center stage, and just tried to make sure that the audience knew like when and where we were at any given time.
Absolutely.
And it's so interesting that you mentioned about how physical this piece is, because I was as I was reading it, there was a line towards the very, very end of the play. And I'm kind of combining a couple of different lines here that said, quote, "You or me, that's what terrifies you. I'm the voice inside your head. I tell the truth. I let you self-destruct." And I was thinking about how interesting a study would be doing a bit of animal imagery with that mother character. Animal imagery, for those of you who don't really know what it is, it's essentially trying to physically embody an animal that you think represents the character of which you're playing. And that specific character of Donna in the show is, I feel like you can do a lot with the physicality there to kind of weave back and forth between the times that it is more inherently present that she's speaking about what's going on in her daughter's head versus the time that she's sharing interactions with her daughter. I think that's just an interesting, I would be interested to do a character study with that sort of idea in mind.
And that seems especially challenging for the actress playing that role because at that moment in time, Astrid has she's been hit and she's suffering a concussion. So she's going in and out of consciousness. And so in her head, it's the actress is switching back and forth from her mother, Donna, to the evil queen. And so that's another big giant physicality that actress has to look at. It's not just Donna, it's a completely trash Donna and then a fantastical evil queen switching back and forth on a dime. So that's a whole moment too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always get very curious. We talked about this in our illusion episode. I love knowing the reason why certain names were chosen. I know some of these were specific to actual historical events. But could you talk about why and how you chose some of the names for these characters?
Sure. So there's 3 different timelines. In the Grimm's storyline, that they're named after the historical people. So it's Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, and then Dorchen was Wilhelm's wife. And the other element to this play that hasn't come up yet is that, okay, so let me go back and weave this in a little bit. So back when this was the children's piece, I didn't know what to do with. The thing in the Snow White fairy tale that I love them, but has never been as interesting to me as other elements are the dwarf characters. And I didn't know what I was going to do with them because I didn't want the Snow White character to just, show up with the dwarves that we've kind of all seen. I wanted to make it as interesting as all the other questions I was asking. And I did a lot of research, and dwarves in the sort of pagan religion of the area, one of the things that they were considered to be was the gatekeepers between worlds. And I found that really interesting, and to really lean into sort of the world of the Fae, which if you don't know that, like it's more like Celtic mythology, Norse, imagine more of like a Lord of the Rings elf than like a Tinkerbell kind of fairy. And I was intrigued by the idea that of that time in history when those pagan gods were starting to be forgotten, and other religions were coming in, which is where sort of, I guess, the American Gods-esque reference comes in. But I was like, okay, if dwarves were like ancient gods and they were the gatekeepers between worlds, what would happen if the people that she finds and she stays with are forgotten gods that are starting to fade away? And instead of having 7 of them, I had 3. So I had Solaris, who was sort of in charge of, the sun and birth and the gatekeeper between, new life and whatnot. I had Gwyll, who was, I guess, in my head, sort of representing like twilight and literally like hangs the moon in the sky every night. And then I had another character, Vernichtung, who was representative of death, or who was death and was the gatekeeper between, life and death. And that's who she met. And in my sort of children's version, one of my favorite parts became her interactions with these 3 people who are disguising themselves as robbers, like living in the woods, but they're actually these deeper beings. And so when I did the rewrite of this show, I realized I was going to kind of have to get rid of them because I wasn't literally telling a Snow White story. But Vernichtung, there was something very, very special about him that I couldn't let him go. And so I renamed him. I renamed him Shadow. There's a specific moment when he encounters one of the characters in the play where he gets that name. It's taken from the Lord's Prayer, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And she says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Call me Shadow." And so he's the one character that's played by one actor the entire time, and Shadow continues throughout all the different storylines. But his original name is Vernichtung, which is, I think, a German word that means destruction. So that's where
I looked that up when I read that in the script. I was like, what is that? Yeah.
So that's where that came from. And then Dorchen is the one who introduces Vernichtung and Solaris and Gwyll. And Solaris literally means sun. Gwyll, I need to double check my research. I think it's another word taken from another language, and I don't remember exactly what it means, but I have it written down somewhere. In the Victorian storyline, there's Jack, who's a theater owner, his wife Isadora, and their stepdaughter Clara. Where did I get each of those names? And their last name is Campbell. Campbell was a common name of the time. It ran in theatrical circles. It also has a certain sound to it. Isadora, it conjures up references of like Isadora Duncan, and she's supposed to be like the great actress of her day. It's also a very period specific name. Jack is what, I like to have really good reasons for naming my characters things, but Jack was just something that sounded right. Like he was just Jack, no matter how like I sliced it. He's kind of a cad. He's like one of those important, charming people who wants to just like, seem like your best friend. I don't know. And then Clara means light. I think it's a beautiful name. It's a classic name. It has sort of fairy tale reference in the sort of more Western versions of the Nutcracker. Clara is the girl in the Nutcracker. And Clara Campbell just also sounds lovely. And then in the modern storyline, Astrid is a reference to the character Astrid from White Oleander. And I think they both share a lot of, not, I was going to say personal history, but I don't mean that. I mean, in terms of growing up with the kind of abuse that they live with. Donna the D is related to Isadora in the sound of their names. But I don't know. I feel bad saying this, but I don't know, Donna, it just sounds like one of those names. Like the mom who's maybe like being a good mom is not the number one descriptor that you would necessarily have, which I don't know. Maybe I don't know any like not great Donnas. So I'm not exactly sure, but, and then Tate just, it's a very contemporary sounding, like I also didn't want any of the names to feel like they were in a timeline that they didn't really belong in. But Tate, it sounds very contemporary. There's a little nod to Tate from American Horror Story. I think there's some similarities to the character of a guy who has a very kind heart, but maybe has not always gone down like the strongest choice path, you might say. And yeah, so those are sort of the basic reasons behind all the names that are in there.
I love Shadow so much as a character.
I love Shadow so much. Yeah.
When I first read it, I just thought of the character of Death in The Book Thief.
Mm-hmm.
And that like, it's rare that you see like a really sweet, sympathetic version of death in something. Like, I love, but also how he can twist on a dime.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, oh, I love Shadow.
I think a couple references with Shadow, and I don't know, Shadow just sort of showed up fully formed in my mind and wouldn't go away. And to this day, he's absolutely one of my favorite characters that I've ever written, and I love him a lot and miss him when I'm not working on something that he's in. Some other references that went into Shadow is the Robert Redford episode of The Twilight Zone. If you guys have ever seen that one, I don't remember what it's called, but it's about this old woman who literally like won't leave her like shack of an apartment for anything, like will not step foot outside because she's convinced that death is like waiting to take her. And then a very young Robert Redford shows up one day as this like adorable, guy who's like broken his ankle, and she takes him in. And sorry, spoilers. By the end, you find out that he's been death the whole time, and he's very sweet. And he's like, have I done anything to you? Like, I'm not scary. And he's like the nicest guy. But then also a little bit of like Professor Snape and his like grumpy cat quality. Because the thing I love about Shadow can be really, really terrifying when he needs to be. And there's definitely a scene where that comes out. But I think most of the time he's kind of depressed. He doesn't really like his job, and he doesn't have anybody to talk to. And he's just, I don't know. I call him Grumpy Pants sometimes because he's just got a little bit of that thing going on. So, but the Astrid Shadow relationship was something that took me very much by surprise, and was something that I didn't really fully find or understand until we went into rehearsal for the show. And I originated the role of Astrid et al. In it, and had a wonderful, wonderful actor who's played Shadow in every incarnation. And we just found something very, very special between those two characters that became the heart of the show. So very, very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, it really is that character has so many surprising elements that you really don't expect to come out of it. And there's this whole scene where he's talking about why everybody, like, kind of similar to that episode of The Twilight Zone, like why everybody's so scared of this idea of death. And I feel like the interactions that the two of them have are just very, very natural in a way that you would speak really to anybody, but releasing those deep, dark fears to the fear itself.
Well, because the interesting thing is, death is a very big thing in fairy tales. It's a very big thing in Snow White. And I talk about it in the play, but to me, Snow White has always been a metaphor for death. I know that the Disney film can get a bad rap viewed through our modern day eyes, but I remember seeing it as a child, and like, I never got the idea from it that it's about a man saving you. Like, to me, and I know I was an unusual child, but it's, like, she dies, like, it's called the sleeping death, and she's resurrected and then says goodbye to the dwarves, like she's never going to see them again, and is taken to a literal castle in the clouds. And in a lot of fairy tales, the royal character, the prince or whoever, is meant to represent God. If you read them in that, like, that's kind of what they're meant to represent. And it's a giant metaphor for death. And so that was something that was really important to me, was the relationship of every character to death and what that means in the piece. But then, you have the character of death who has to go around, taking people's lives. And then he meets this girl, Astrid, who all she wants in life is to die. Like, that's all she wants, and has literally been flirting with death her entire life. And it develops this sort of star-crossed romance between the two, where she wants to die and be with him, and he wants her to live so that the things that are important will be remembered. And it's this really, I think, unusual dynamic. And yeah, there's a whole moment, and it's only in stage direction in the play, in the last scene, where one of the conventions of the play is that when Shadow kisses you, that's when you die. He can have crueler ways of doing it, but in general, Shadow kisses you, that's how you die. And there's this beautiful moment where Astrid and Shadow, they're talking, and then it just goes silent, and they go to kiss each other. And at the last second, Shadow pulls away, and it just devastates her. And it was a moment that was completely found in rehearsal. And it's just completely silent with no words. And it's like my favorite moment in the show. So yeah, I like exploring that.
The rehearsal room is a beautiful place.
Yep. Yeah.
So
I love that moment.
So this play deals a lot with a lot in terms of it's really all over the map. It takes you kind of through every emotion that you can possibly go through, between sort of fear, excitement, love, depression. Like, there's just so much here, and there are so many very, like, there's a scene of rape that happens in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a bit of abuse, things like that. But it's mentioned in the play, and you mentioned it earlier as well, about this idea of like, well, if we tell children these stories earlier on in life, maybe they'll be a little bit more prepared for what the real, quote unquote, real world is like.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of curious as to know, like, what your intended audience is of this play.
Yeah. Well, let's be really clear. This is not a play for children.
Right.
Not a play for children. I think the play is asking the question about the power of stories and how we should tell stories. It's not meant to be making a decision on that and executing it. So we did not let anybody under the age of, I believe, 13 into the theater to come see the show. And there were a million disclaimers on this piece. It's an adult show. It's meant for an adult audience. That being said, there is a child character in the show. She was originated by the incredible Gracie Beardsley, who's a wonderful, she's not a child anymore. She's going to college next year, but was a wonderful child actor, is now a wonderful young adult actor, who, her family's also amazing. These issues were very well dealt with, communally and whatnot. And we did have some older young people who did come with a lot of preparation and a lot of disclaimers. But it's intended for an adult audience, because it's taking a very unflinching look at some very, very dark issues, and asking questions about where the line is in terms of the stories we tell children does not mean that we should be experimenting with where that line is with this piece. So
for sure.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned before that you did work with an intimacy director on this piece. Can you talk a little bit about that experience? We talked a little bit about intimacy directors in our last episode.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I have a wonderful go-to person. His name's Mick Blyer. He's a wonderful actor, like, in his own right. I've worked with him as an actor. He's amazing. He's also a dancer. He does all sorts of stuff, but he's a spectacular fight choreographer, and he does intimacy direction, and he's worked with me on most of my shows. He was our fight choreographer, intimacy director for Trial. And we've been doing some development with another piece of mine called Peculiar Creatures. So he's extraordinary. And I also want to say he was nominated for a New York Innovative Theater Award for Best Choreography. It was him and a bunch of like dance choreographers. So that just should hopefully go to show you what an incredible, incredible job he did with this piece. I believe intimacy directors are hugely important. There's now like an official, like the Society of Intimacy Directors. I don't believe that any show that deals with intimacy in any way should move forward without having somebody on their production team who's an intimacy director. And working with Mick specifically is just a really wonderful experience. And I think that the biggest thing is, you first sort of sit down with first of all, you're upfront with what the physical requirements of the show are in your audition breakdown. You make that clear from the get-go. But then, it starts with just, conversations as a group, individually. What is the story that we're trying to tell with this scene? Emotionally, what do we want the audience to get? What needs to be communicated? What's the best way to do that? There's practical conversations about, what is your comfort level physically? What's your fight choreography experience? Because something like the rape scene, for example, which is not something I put in a show lightly, but it's an important piece of this show, it's not just an intimacy scene. It's a combat scene. It's a very serious combat scene. So it's, what are your comfort levels? How much of a physical performer are you? All that stuff. And then it's just that it's done very technically with constantly everybody in the room being asked, how do you feel? Are you comfortable with this? Are you not comfortable with this? And yeah, it's well, funny is maybe not the right word, but I think it's a little funny in that I'm very proud of the way we were able to execute all of those moments in the show. And most people would come up to me at the end and be like, "Oh my gosh, that rape scene, that must have been like the hardest thing for you to do. How do you do that every night?" And I'm like, it's actually not, because Mick did an incredible job and I'm with a wonderful company and it's very technical. And for me, that's more of almost like a dance moment. The hardest thing for me to do in the show was the last scene, which is just like emotionally like stab you in the heart. But I think that is because we had a really, really amazing fight choreographer, intimacy director that we were working with, who made that all stellar and spectacular. And I've been in situations where you don't have somebody like that. I've been in situations where I've been asked to improv that, where it's like, do whatever you feel, and like under no circumstances is that okay. And it just makes the moment better, because it means that you're able to really take it beat by beat, and how are we best able to do this. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience. If anybody's looking for somebody, Mick Blyer is incredible. So yeah, highly, highly recommend working with an intimacy director.
Yeah, it needs one.
Yeah.
I don't know how it could ever be done without one, really.
Yeah. Well, and there's also little thing. The thing is, this piece has a lot of parallels and stuff too. So, for example, the way things weave in and out is the rape scene goes directly into this very sort of poetic transition moment of Clara turning into Astrid and then having a very consensual physical moment with her boyfriend, which it's goes from being played by the same actress, somebody who is completely innocent, knows nothing about sexuality, having a very traumatic experience, to somebody who's very comfortable in their sexuality, having a very consensual, fun time. But we were then able to make that poetic too, and we were able to incorporate almost parallel gestures and things like that it was transforming one moment into another, that then just aided everything else. So there's lots of reasons to work with an intimacy director. Can't recommend it highly enough.
There were a couple moments in here as well that I was thinking, like this entire play talks so much about how everything is relative to each other. Mm-hmm. There is no love without hate. There's no darkness without light, kind of all of that different sort of idea. And it's so interesting because it also talks a lot about like choosing good, being good, trusting the good. And something that I wrote down that I just thought was so interesting is that obviously everybody's definition of good is different depending on what your relative experiences to good have been. And it's an interesting idea to kind of, I feel like each character here has different experiences in mm-hmm. terms of the levels of negativity or difficult things that have happened in their life, and the way that influences kind of their relationship with death, their relationship with good, their relationship with trust. Yeah. I didn't know if any of that, was something that just kind of came naturally with the writing process, or was that something that you really wanted to highlight in each specific storyline?
Well, the relationship to that is very important, and it goes back to the Snow White story in the from the beginning, of this idea of beauty and this idea of goodness. I mean, it's written into the organic nature of of the story. I also always found it really interesting as a child reading the story. And if the evil queen's number one goal is to be the most beautiful in the land, but she grows to hate Snow White so much that she deliberately turns herself into an ugly hag in order to kill her, thereby completely negating her entire goal. So I open the play with an original fairy tale that I wrote that deals with that, and it's about a king who has two daughters, one of whom says, if only I were the most beautiful in the land, father would love and prize me above anyone, and the other says, if only I were the most good person in the land, father would love and prize me more than anyone. And so they both pursue that single-mindedly. And the first daughter becomes very beautiful, but grows vain and prideful and cruel. And the second daughter works to become good, but to a place where she becomes almost prideful in how good she is and how humble she is and that she's better than everybody else. And finally, the father comes back and is horrified by the change in his daughters and basically says, you didn't need to be beautiful or good to earn my love. Don't you understand? You were beautiful already and might have been truly good if you had known in your heart that you were already loved. If goodness could be earned, I fear no one would ever obtain it, for we are none of us as pure and good as we ought to be. Beauty will fade, and goodness will not protect you from trials. Therefore, be joyful and love others, not to get a reward, but to honor the love that has been so freely given to you. Put your hope in love. And that then becomes, I think, the theme of the whole piece, where you have the mother characters throughout of Isadora and Donna who feel like they have lost or are losing their power in a way that is directly tied to their youth and beauty. Isadora is literally being replaced in her acting company by her young ingenue child. And especially in Victorian times, if that really happens, she has no way of earning a living. If she loses her husband, like what's going to happen? She's going to end up in the poorhouse or like a mental institution, like, or on the street. Like that's all that happened to women back then. And so beauty and youth is literally her source of survival. And then Donna, it's a similar thing where she feels that, you know, she gave up everything that she had to raise this child who, you know, and whatnot. So that's the theme that goes through there. And then with Clara and Astrid, Clara is a young, very innocent girl who's been raised on these kind of saccharine morals of, you know, if you just are good, nothing bad will happen. And so she's been obsessively trying to be a good girl her whole life. And then horrific things do happen to her and she can't reconcile this and then ends up blaming herself because, oh, well, then I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. And her death partially comes out of this like desperate need to finally be good enough. We have sort of two equivalent of the apple moments from the fairy tale, ones with Clara, ones with Astrid. And Clara goes into it eyes wide open, knowing exactly what's going to happen and doing it because she'll finally be good enough to earn her mother's love if she does this. And Astrid, it's the opposite. It's her completely fighting back. But Astrid is the flip side of somebody who has been convinced her whole life that she's just not a good person. And she wants to be desperately, but feels like she never can be. And it's just completely destroyed her. And so then that whole theme comes back at the end again with Shadow. And the almost last line of the show is, you know, you do not earn love. Him saying to her, you do not earn love because you are good. Be good because you are loved. And so, yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying that. Yeah, it was very thought out and it's very important. And it's the idea that we are the choices that we make. And ideally coming from a place where we're already loved and accepted can help us go out in the world and then make positive choices in relation to other people. But very bad things happen when you feel like you are relying on both of those things in order to survive.
Speaking of the ending, I love it. And the one thing that I love about it is how open-ended it is. Like I mentioned to you once, it's like the Giver ending, like you as the reader decide, or you as the audience decide how this ends. And it's interesting because the first time I read it, I had a very clear, you know, I was like, she wakes up. Mm-hmm. Like that was my first instinct. And then my most recent time reading it in preparation for this, I thought the opposite.
Yeah.
And
I really like implicating audiences because I think what to me is powerful in that moment is, so what happens basically is Astrid is given she has to decide whether she's going to wake up from this coma or not. And the very end of the show is she turns to the audience, opens her mouth to say something, and there's a blackout. And what I wanted that to do is I wanted you as an audience member to have a gut internal reaction of what you want her to do, which then should hopefully then inform you something about yourself. It is very open-ended. I'm really intrigued by the fact that you felt so differently. Audiences people would be very adamant about what they thought happened. There were people who like, well, of course she wakes up. She has to. It has to, you know, have a happy ending. And some people not. And then like me and my stage manager would sometimes joke. There'd be sometimes they'd come back after the show and be like, Astrid's not waking up tonight. Like, I'd just be like in a stage like, yeah, I don't think Astrid woke up tonight. But yeah, so no, that's very important to me that it be ambiguous and open-ended in order that to me, the audience is very much another character in the play. And the reason to do a work of art is to edify the audience in some way or make you think about something. So hopefully in that moment you have this gut reaction and that causes you to think, why did I have that gut reaction about what she does?
I feel like one of the most exciting things that anybody in theater, at least the best response that I've ever gotten to any piece of work that I've ever done in any aspect has been, we had a conversation about it after. Mm-hmm. I went home and I had a conversation with people after, or me and this other person, we had a whole conversation. I think that idea of like maybe two people having these opposite ideas of what they think happens to her at the end sparks this whole conversation of just the overall everything, because it's so intricately connected to everything, like it's almost like whatever you choose gives you an insight of like your glass half full, glass half empty sort of perspective. And then you get to go back and think to yourself, well, what happened that made me think that way? What is it about this that made me think that way? Or what is it about my mindset that's making me think that way? And it can really spark this like very collaborative and sort of back and forth motion with other people about their thoughts on it.
Yeah. So normally at around this point, we would get into kind of, if we were put in the director's shoes or the designer's shoes, what would we want to see done with the piece? Where I think this is a little different is it's very clear how this production is staged with this troupe of actors acting out the different timelines. Mm-hmm. Katie, did you have any specific thoughts about design stuff?
The only thing that really I was going back and forth with, because as I've mentioned in both of our previous episodes, and I'm sure I'll mention it throughout all of the others because I feel very passionate about it, is that I don't really like working on the proscenium. I just feel like it takes away from the intimacy of the type of theater that I enjoy doing. However, in this particular show, what I would love about working in the proscenium is almost that it gives the same storytelling aspect of the whole show in terms of the audience being involved, but also being separate from you and being able to watch the story and create their own kind of ideas from it without making them feel that danger or discomfort directly by having it right in front of them, as you would if you were in like a 3/4 thrust or like, in the round, whatever black box type atmosphere. I almost feel like it would be a good symbol in a way by having them on the proscenium and making it this sort of storytelling thing. But on the other hand, on the part of me that also enjoys making the audience a little uncomfortable and enjoys making them feel like they're right in the danger of it, I don't know. I feel like I could go either way in that aspect. And the only other thing that I really said here is that I think just for staging, me personally as a director, I really like using the kiss-kill zone. And I feel like in this particular play, the kiss-kill zone is very similar. And they both do the exact same thing. So I almost feel more inclined to use it more. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's essentially a specific distance that you get within another actor that you would only get within if you were wanting to kill them or kiss them, basically. And other than that, not getting too close to your actor because it takes away from either the language or the moment. And I think it's a really unique situation here in which the kiss-kill zone is utilized in both senses, which almost makes me want to use it more. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much all that I had for design elements, because it is so set up exactly with what should be done, which I also like. I think that makes me feel more comfortable as an actor. I like knowing what I'm kind of getting myself into. So I really like that. How about you, Julia?
It's interesting that you brought up that you wanted to do a site-specific piece for this, Ashley, because when I read it, I was like, oh, this would be so cool in a more like amphitheater setting. Mainly because there's something so inherently, I don't want to say like synonymous, but this idea of Snow White and the woods. Like whenever I picture Snow White, I immediately think of woods and forest and outdoors. And I feel like if there was a production of this that was outside, it would just solidify that fantastical energy that this show just naturally has embedded in it.
Mm-hmm. It's a challenging piece to stage. And the way we did it is we had a trunk that was custom made, big old trunk. Every costume piece and prop fit inside. So it was literally like the magic trunk that everything came out of. And really, like it says, you really, in the stage directions, like really utilizing it in terms of old fashioned theatrical techniques. So the trunk became everything. The trunk became the hospital bed. It became the bedroom. It became a wall. At one point that I love this, and Julia, you'll especially like this. The trunk, when you look at it, looks smaller than it actually is. There's more room inside of it than you think. And there's a scene where Astrid, she's in the coma and her sort of dream is turning into a nightmare, and demons are attacking her. And she talks about that they come and they trap her in a box buried under the ground and she can't get out. And so the entire, so basically what we did, most of the cast was involved even in things that they weren't physically in. So like in Astrid's fantasy world, the actors that weren't Astrid and Shadow came out dressed in all black with LED lights that they used as little fireflies. And then suddenly when it turned dark, those turned into flashlights. And all the lights in the theater went out except for those flashlights that just kept getting closer and closer and closer to her. And the cast forced me into the trunk and slammed the lid closed and locked it. And the scene after that is the scene where Shadow confronts Isadora about murdering Clara. And one of the big conversation points in that is, what did you do with the body? And the trunk is being used as Isadora's dressing table. And the entire audience knows that I, as a human being, am still inside that trunk while they're having this conversation about Clara's dead body. It was super comfortable for me. I was fine. It was one of my favorite moments of the show. I'm like the opposite of claustrophobic, but there was also way more space in that trunk than anybody would think. But watching it from the outside, it looks like I'm crammed in a trunk that's like way too small for me to be in, which was just a psychological thing, like in the back of people's minds. I do prefer doing this particular show in a proscenium for exactly the reasons that you said, Katie. This is a piece that you want the audience to be able to take a little bit of distance from the really violent moments that are happening. That being said, there were moments when Shadow was watching the proceedings almost the entire show. And a lot of times it was with the audience, and he would sit in the aisle, like next to the audience while things were happening. The other thing that we did was it was done very proscenium until we get into Astrid's fantasy world for the first time, in which there were all these beautiful, I call them like fairy lights, that were rigged up over the entire ceiling of the entire theater, like not just over the plain area, but like over the audience. And all of a sudden those all faded up. So the audience suddenly felt like the plain space was becoming more inclusive of them. And the only time that happened was when we went into the fantasy world. So it was very immersive in those moments. And yeah. And it was, and then things like when it was the transition from young Clara to adult Clara, we had a couple actors come out and hold rope that had been tied together to form a rectangle like a mirror. And Isadora and young Clara were each other's reflection. And then I stood back to back with young Clara, and we did this cool kind of choreographed rotation. And suddenly I was Isadora's reflection. It's just playing with stagecraft, and it's super, super fun. It does get to be very difficult tracking where props and costume pieces are, especially because there's a lot of quick changes. And I'm not going to say I wouldn't love to see a production that has like a multi-million-dollar budget to work with. And because some of the like magic and illusion work that you could do with this piece would be just amazing if you had that kind of budget. But yeah, very, very sort of like, how do we do this? How do you make Astrid fly and land on a mountaintop? How do you make fireflies everywhere? With a trunk, and I like that. I find it enjoyable. And it's also kind of liberating because you don't have to worry about like a piece of tech malfunctioning. You don't have to worry that the space that you're doing the show in can't accommodate you. Like you can literally do it anywhere. And I really enjoy that.
It's also so interesting with having that idea of having like multiple copies of like different props in different places. There's no worse feeling on stage than being like, where is what I'm looking for?
Oh, you want to hear a great story? So, apples obviously figure very prominently into this play. And they appear multiple times, and they're real because bites need to be taken out of them. And we need multiple ones because we need, fresh apples. So our stage manager, before like we did all this, all the apples are always placed where they need to be placed. But in addition, we had a giant, just extra bag of apples, like right backstage in case like something happened and we need, like it was right there. Our lovely stage manager was like, there's your bag of apples. Like if something goes wrong. The very first space that we did the show was a setup where if you exit through the aisle, you're stuck and you can't go backstage. So like if you're up the aisle, you're up the aisle. And our shadow made his first entrance through the aisle. So he had to start the stage like from there, couldn't get backstage. So we're doing the top of the show and I make like a quick exit. And one of the other actors who's supposed to enter like with an apple runs up to me and is like, I can't find like they're gone. Like the apples aren't here. I can't find them. Like they're not here. And I'm like, oh no. And I knew there was like an extra one up the aisle or something. So I like made a quick, there's a moment where I'm like looking for my mom and I'm running all over and I'm like, mom. And I ran up the aisle and I like whispered really quickly to Shadow. I'm like, they can't find the apples. Like bring the one that's up here. And so then he's like trying to like hide it in his pocket, and, like bring it or something. We're all stressed out because we're like, what are we going to do? Like, this is clearly like really, really important to the show. Like we can't continue if we don't have apples in some of these scenes. And then this actor who had made that comment enters with an apple. And I'm like, okay. And we exit later. He's like, oh yeah. No, it was like there. I just like didn't see it.
Oh my God.
And in the meantime, I'm like somebody's like texting the stage manager and they're up in the booth, like trying to run the show. And they're like, it's in there's a giant bag of like 50 apples. They're right there. Like, no, they're gone. They're like, how can they be gone? They were right there. It's like 10 pounds of apples. And he's like, oh no. Yeah. They were like, I just like didn't see it. And I'm like, it was, that was like the one time. And it was just, no, but that was a thing. I mean, we obviously had people setting props and everything for the show, but with that show, it was go and check every single one of your props before the show because, if it's not where it's supposed to be, there's going to be problems. There's a lot of quick changes. There's a lot of things that props are really important because they do everything. So, yep, that was fun. That was fun.
Wow. So usually this is about the time that we start talking about some calls to action that we have, and essentially that is the things that we're taking away from the play, messages, themes, ideas that we found very prominent, and kind of regenerating that into a way that we want to put that back out into the world. So Julia, do you have any calls to action that you would like to share about this play?
I do. So the first one that immediately popped into my mind was blame the person at fault, not the other woman. Because we see this come up multiple times, and literally, like, it's so prevalent right now. Like, I don't know if you all know about the driver's license controversy about that song that just came out.
No,
I don't know anything that's happening ever really in entertainment.
So this young artist, Olivia Rodriguez, she's very talented. She put out a song called Driver's License, and it was talking about a boy who broke her heart, and now he's with another girl. Mm-hmm. And, like, yeah, it's a great song. It's a really good song. We've all been there. We all know. And then the girl who she referenced in the song put out another song as kind of like well, I'm with him, and you're just going to have to deal with that. And so now everyone on the internet is like, oh, well, I'm Team Olivia. I'm Team Sabrina. And I'm like, shouldn't we be, like, a boy broke her heart. He led her on and then, went off with this other girl. As far as we know, no one knows the full story. But, like, why are we pitting these two women against each other when, like, the girl didn't do anything to harm the other one and vice versa? Yeah. And so with this one specifically, especially with Isadora's character, you know, instead of being mad at the man who cheated on her and raped their stepchild, she targeted all her aggression at the stepchild. And so I think, like, especially since this is still a thing we're seeing, my call to action would be, well, let's blame the person at fault, not the victims of the situation. So that was one of mine, Katie. What do you have?
Oh, well, thank you for asking, Julia. I have so many calls to action here. Obviously, this show has so many things you can take away from it, but I think my biggest one that I take away from it is really about being a storyteller. You know, Ashley, I think you mentioned this earlier, but, you know, there's a line in the play that says, quote, "We can't see the fruits of our labor. Sometimes they're invisible," end quote. And so my takeaway there really is to stop apologizing for being a storyteller. You know, I feel like a lot of times, at least for me, I can get in my own head in thinking that, you know, I'm not doing anything of any importance and all I'm doing is being an actor. And I feel like I'm the only person with that mindset that I is in my immediate circle of people between my family and my friends. And so I think for me, just because we can't see the effect of what we're doing or the power of what we might be doing, I think it's important for me to remember that that's invisible in this field sometimes, and it doesn't mean that what I'm doing isn't being heard or received or appreciated or talked about for, you know, changing the world for the better, all of that kind of stuff. So I think for me, really this pandemic has shown me the power of art and the power of entertainment, because honestly, where in the world would we be right now in the state of the world if we did not have that? It was the only thing that I feel like that got all of us through it. So, you know, to kind of appreciate that more and appreciate myself and respect myself as a storyteller and as an artist, so that I can push myself to kind of be the best one that I can be, you know?
I think I love that. And I think we really do underestimate the importance of stories, to make sense of the world, to learn. I always think about the fact that in the Bible, that Christ is a storyteller. That, you know, Christ doesn't really sit down and say, like, you know, you shouldn't do. I mean, he does at, you know, at moments and whatnot, but it's always, let me tell you a story. You know, when they're about to stone the woman, he doesn't stand there and say, well, you all, you know, shouldn't be doing this because you've all done bad things too. He gives an analogy. He tells stories about things, and that's what really deeply affects our hearts. And I think one of the other things I'd encourage people to look at in this piece is the idea of interconnectedness and the fact that we are all connected. We're not separate, like no matter how much time or history is between us. It's one of the reasons that I have these three storylines, is because none of these individual stories could really be told alone. You know, Clara's story from beginning to end would not work as its own play. The climax, the culmination to the Grimms and the Victorian is in Astrid's. The beginning to Astrid's is in the Grimms. Stories literally save Astrid's life, you know, throughout her whole life. And one of the things that I really love that, again, Shadow does is at the end, he tells her a story, and it's the story of how everything we've just seen is connected. You know, once upon a time, there were these brothers. Once upon a time, there was this woman, and he connects them all into one story. And I think that it's really damaging when we think of ourselves being isolated, and we think about it just being us. And the fact that we're all interconnected, and influence each other and are part of each other's stories is very important too.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite quotes from this play is more than a tale is lost when a story is forgotten. And the call to action that definitely spoke to me from that line was preserving cultural stories. Because like we lose like cultural pillars when we don't tell stories. I think specifically about like luckily because of things like Disney, we have a lot of versions of European fairy tales, but how many, African or Asian fairy tales are we never going to get to hear because they were wiped out, or that part of culture was literally stripped away. And another thing specifically with storytelling that stuck out to me about this show is how many storytellers haven't been able to tell stories because of abuse or neglect. Because there's the tragedy of what if Astrid doesn't wake up? What if she is unable to tell stories?
And I think the analogy for that is something that I really love is that stories is one of the things I love about theater is that the abstract or the ethereal can be made literal and physical. And so one of the ways that I think this play does that is, we're talking about stories and not wanting stories to be forgotten and what that represents culturally and everything. And that's made physically manifest in Shadow, who is an ancient god who has literally lost his entire family because one by one they've been forgotten. And in the mythology of this show, when a god or demigod or however you want to say it, or a fae or whatnot is forgotten, they cease to exist in the earthly plane. And so one of the big reasons that Shadow wants Astrid to wake up and tell stories is not just this sort of ethereal, so then the stories don't die. It's these stories are my siblings. Like, I want them back. And I think about that in the way that, I don't know, I've been thinking about it a lot during COVID and stuff about just like how many people have died, and the idea, like, if you have somebody close to you that you've lost, the need to keep them alive and tell stories about them and whatnot. And I remember watching the memorial when the day before Biden's inauguration, where they did the lights on the by the Lincoln Memorial, and how many people that represented. And I'm like, we don't know their names. We don't know like what they did. We don't know like what was special about each of these people, the things they said that were important, the things that made them unique. And that's another way of story, like the stories. There's a line that Tait has where he's talking about an actual monument that's in Germany to the books that were burned. And it's, you walk in this square and it's this just plexiglass like circle, and you look straight through it, and underneath are rows and rows and rows of empty bookshelves, enough to house all the books that were burned. And Tait says that he had a dream that instead of books, it was people, that it was for all the lives of all the people who were lost and have been forgotten. Like the stories of their lives were erased, just like the books. And I think that that's how we need to view stories and people and whatnot, and that it's all of a piece in terms of them being remembered. And the other thing with fairy tales is a lot of these fairy tales potentially had basis in historical truth. For example, a lot of people think Margareta von Waldeck was one of the historical bases for the Snow White story. In the first place, there was also a crazy man in like Germany a long time ago, apparently, who would sell apples to children with razor blades in them. And it's like, who would know who Margareta von Waldeck is unless you were like a random fairy tale scholar? But she was a person who we now remember because something about that got woven into a story. So I don't know if any of that made sense, but I think that importance is something that we should all think about.
Absolutely. What do you think, Julia? Do you think that we're pretty good here?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk about this play for another like 7 hours.
I have so many things I could say about this play. So many things. and I guess kind of just one last final thought that I have here is that, I think a line that you had said earlier, in that I had also written down was, put your hope in love, honor the love that's been given so freely to you, and put your hope in love. And I feel like, especially, in light of the last few weeks in our particular country, I feel like I've had a very hard time putting the love in hope and finding that hope. And obviously, I definitely don't want to get too political on this podcast, but theater is political. And I think if we don't talk about some of those things, what's the point of doing what we're doing? And so I think, for me, I've seen what feels to me like so much destruction and chaos and vengeance and hatred and just power trips by so many people for so many different reasons all over the world. And I feel like this whole play, the biggest theme that I really take away from all of it is love and hope. And I think that trusting the power of love is something that is enough to make you, at least me, want to get up out of bed every day and go tackle the world. And I think that the way that you have incorporated that theme in all of these storylines is just so brilliantly done. And something that I think a lot of people should kind of take away from this as well.
Well, and the fact that it's a choice, that I think that it can be very difficult when you think about like, okay, I have to, put my hope in love and I have to hope and stuff. And then you wake up and you're like, I don't feel hopeful. Like I don't feel it, but it's that you don't have to feel that. You don't have to necessarily wake up every morning bathed in a feeling of, ethereal love, which would be great. And the days that we do, that's wonderful, but it's cool. Well, I don't feel that way, but it's about it being a choice. So if I did have hope, what would I do right now? And Shadow says a lot of good things. I love Shadow. Goodness isn't a feeling; it's a choice. And I think that that's something that we sometimes forget. And I think we're so encouraged to focus on feelings that it's like, no, you don't have to feel that. I haven't really felt like hopeful in a while, but you get up and you make choices based on, okay, well, what if hope is real? What would I do? And we do it anyway.
Yeah.
I love that perspective because, like you said, right now it is so hard to keep, your heart open.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I'm going to make the choice to love. I'm going to make the choice to act as though I have hope. Mm-hmm. That's such a valuable perspective right now.
Well, and it's interesting thinking about, I've been thinking about this show in relation to politics a lot lately, actually. And one of the ways is this show went up in its first production in 2016. And, like 6-9 months later is when Trump was elected. And I don't know if I would have written this play in this way a year later. I know what I did write a year later, and it's not this play. It's a play that is very much dealing, it's the Shadowlands. I think Julia, you've read the Shadowlands, but which is very much dealing with what was going on in life. But also, I have a T-shirt that I really like that says, "Don't make me repeat myself." History, like it's a quote that history is saying. And a lot of people don't know the history of the Grimm brothers and how that related to what happened later in Germany. And to me, it's really important because, and again, it goes back to storytelling. Like we got to know our stories. And I think that, we sort of grow up and we're taught this very black and white idea of like what happened during the Holocaust, that like, oh, well, there were some really evil people and they did some really evil things. Wasn't that like really horrible that those evil people did such terrible things? Like, isn't it great that we're not like that? And it's not like what happened. These just bad people like crawled out of the earth one day, like, and did that. And especially with what's been going on now with white supremacy and Nazis in our country and whatnot, what a lot of people don't realize about the way that all happened that's talked about in this play is Germany was not a unified country until almost the 1900s. It was a collection of city-states. And also, hence why in those fairy tales there's so many different kingdoms, because they're literally like war. And they were dead in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. And so Napoleon and the French would come through, they'd conquer them. The first thing they would do is burn all the German art. They'd burn all their books, of which there were no copies. All of their culture would be wiped out, and they'd be like, you're French now. And then the Prussians would come in, burn everything. You're not French anymore. You're Prussian, and we're going to kill anybody that like collaborated with the French. And this happened for years. This went on. And the Grimm brothers, I mean, at the time, the German language was not considered really a valid language. It didn't have its own dictionary. It had no culture left. And the Grimm brothers were like, we believe that being German is a valid thing, and that we have a beautiful culture, and that if somebody doesn't do something to preserve it, that we're going to be wiped off the face of the planet. So they started preserving the fairy tales. They also have a collection of folk tales, which is where we get like the Pied Piper and stuff from. It's a whole other story, the difference between fairy tales and folk tales. And they're also the ones who wrote the big German dictionary and preserved the language for the first time. They were very instrumental behind getting Germany to unify. And so Germany finally unified. And then World War I happened, and they were completely devastated by World War I. And between everything from the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, the German people were literally like, we're not putting up with this again. We're not going to be wiped off the face of the planet. We're not going to have our culture erased. And then that clearly swung to a really, really, really horrific direction of we're the best, and, you know, and all that. And then the irony of them going over and conquering France and trying to conquer Russia, it was partly as retribution for what had been done to them for all those years. And so I think that if we know our stories and we know where things came from, that we can say like, well, wait a minute, you know, these were human beings, and how do we make sure that this doesn't happen to us? So yeah. And again, it all affects each other. So I'm a giant nerd. People always ask me like, how much research did I have to do to write this play? I'm like, literally none. I just like, because I'm Hermione Granger and I'm annoying. So
no, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. Ashley, we can't thank you enough for coming and talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
Yes. And where should our listeners follow you?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to my website, which is ashleygriffinofficial.com, ASHLEYGRIFFIN official.com, Griffin like Gryffindor. There's links to all my social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I think Twitter is at Ashley J. Griffin and Instagram is at Ashley Griffin Official. But if you come to my website, you can follow me in all those ways. Yeah, and I post like what I'm doing and what I'm up to. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me. And there's also on my website, there's a whole page for Snow. So you can see photos from the productions. There's actually a short film that was made inspired by one of the scenes that you can see me and the original Shadow do. Lots of fun activities for quarantine when you're stuck at home and you have nothing left on Netflix to watch. So
Perfect. Well, as always, make sure to go ahead and follow us at Playdate Podcast on Instagram. If you have any questions, ideas, any responses to this podcast, or any questions for Ashley, of course, you can shoot us an email at podcastplaydate@gmail.com. And always just keep checking back for more stuff. Julia, do you want to tell everybody what we'll be talking about next week?
Next week, we will be having Family Court Vision podcast with us to talk about some basketball. March Madness, baby.
Troy Bolton has nothing on me.
Oh, no.
Let's talk about some basketball.
What team?
Wildcats. Perfect.
Oh my gosh.
Awesome.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Playdate.
You can follow us on Instagram at playdate.podcast for updates, giveaways, and more fun stuff.
Our cover art was designed by the amazingly talented Haley Denton Hughes.
And our theme music was composed and recorded by Mickey Wadsworth.
I'm Kate.
And I'm Julia.
Keep playing.